Battle of the Little Bighorn. The Battle of the Little Bighorn, known to the Lakota and other Plains Indians as the Battle of the Greasy Grass and also commonly referred to as Custer's Last Stand, the battle which resulted in the defeat of U.S. forces, was the most significant action of the Great Sioux War of 1876. It took place on June 25–26, 1876, along the Little Bighorn River in the Crow Indian Reservation in southeastern Montana Territory. The fight was an overwhelming victory for the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho, who were led by several major war leaders, including Crazy Horse and Chief Gall, and had been inspired by the visions of Sitting Bull Tļatļáŋka Íyotake. The U.S. 7th Cavalry, a force of 700 men, suffered a major defeat while commanded by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, formerly a brevetted major general during the American Civil War. 5 of the 7th Cavalry's 12 companies were annihilated and Custer was killed, as were 2 of his brothers, a nephew, and a brother-in-law. The total U.S. casualty count included 268 dead and 55 severely wounded. 6 died later from their wounds, including 4 Crow Indian scouts and at least 2 Arikara Indian scouts. Public response to the Great Sioux War varied in the immediate aftermath of the battle. Libby Custer, Custer's widow, soon worked to burnish her husband's memory, and during the following decades Custer and his troops came to be considered iconic, even heroic, figures in American history. The battle and Custer's actions in particular have been studied extensively by historians. Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument honors those who fought on both sides. Background: battlefield and surrounding areas. In 1805, fur trader Francois Antoine Larocque reported joining a Crow camp in the Yellowstone area. On the way he noted that the Crow hunted buffalo on the Small Horn River. St. Louis-based fur trader Manuel Lisa built Fort Raymond in 1807 for trade with the Crow. It was located near the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Bighorn River, about 40 miles 64 km north of the future battlefield. The area is first noted in the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie. In the latter half of the 19th century, tensions increased between the native inhabitants of the Great Plains of the U.S. and encroaching settlers. This resulted in a series of conflicts known as the Sioux Wars, which took place from 1854 to 1890. While some of the indigenous people eventually agreed to relocate to ever-shrinking reservations, a number of them resisted, sometimes fiercely. On May 7, 1868, the valley of the Little Bighorn became a tract in the eastern part of the new Crow Indian Reservation in the center of the old Crow country. There were numerous skirmishes between the Sioux and Crow tribes, so when the Sioux were in the valley in 1876, without the consent of the Crow tribe, the Crow supported the U.S. Army to expel them, e.g. Crows enlisted as Army scouts, and Crow warriors would fight in the nearby Battle of the Rosebud. The battlefield is known as Greasy Grass to the Lakota, Dakota, Cheyenne, and most other Plains Indians. However, in contemporary accounts by participants, it was referred to as the Valley of Chieftains. 1876. Sundance Ceremony. Among the Plains tribes, the long-standing ceremonial tradition known as the Sundance was the most important religious event of the year. It is a time for prayer and personal sacrifice for the community, as well as making personal vows. Towards the end of spring in 1876, the Lakota and the Cheyenne held a Sundance that was also attended by a number of agency Indians who had slipped away from their reservations. During a Sundance around June 5, 1876, on Rosebud Creek in Montana, Sitting Bull, the spiritual leader of the Hunkpapa Lakota, reportedly had a vision of soldiers falling into his camp like grasshoppers from the sky. At the same time, U.S. military officials were conducting a summer campaign to force the Lakota and the Cheyenne back to their reservations, using infantry and cavalry in a so-called three-pronged approach. 1876 U.S. military campaign. Colonel John Gibbon's column of 6 companies A, B, H, I, and K of the 7th Infantry and 4 companies F, G, H, and L of the 2nd Cavalry marched east from Fort Ellis in western Montana on March 30 to patrol the Yellowstone River. Brig General George Crook's column of 10 companies A, B, C, D, F, G, I, L, and M of the 3rd Cavalry, 5 companies A, B, D, E, and I of the 2nd Cavalry, 2 companies D and F of the 4th Infantry, and 3 companies C, G, and H of the 9th Infantry moved north from Fort Fetterman in the Wyoming Territory on May 20. Brig General Alfred Terry's column, including 12 companies A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, K, L, and M of the 7th Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's immediate command, companies C and G of the 17th U.S. Infantry, and the Gatling gun detachment of the 20th Infantry departed westward from Fort Abraham Lincoln in the. They were accompanied by teamsters and packers with 150 wagons and a large contingent of pack mules that reinforced Custer. Companies C, D, and I of the 6th U.S. Infantry moved along the Yellowstone River from Fort Buford on the Missouri River to set up a supply depot and joined Terry on May 29 at the mouth of the Powder River. They were later joined there by the steamboat Far West, which was loaded with 200 tons of supplies from Fort Lincoln. 7th Cavalry Organization. The 7th Cavalry had been created just after the American Civil War. Many men were veterans of the war, including most of the leading officers. A significant portion of the regiment had previously served for 1/2 years at Fort Riley, Kansas, during which time it fought one major engagement and numerous skirmishes, experiencing casualties of 36 killed and 27 wounded. 6 other troopers had died of drowning in '51 in cholera epidemics. In November 1868, while stationed in Kansas, the 7th Cavalry under Custer had successfully routed Black Kettle's Southern Cheyenne camp on the Washita River in the Battle of Washita River, an attack which was at the time labeled a massacre of innocent Indians by the Indian Bureau. By the time of the Little Bighorn, half of the 7th Cavalry's companies had just returned from 18 months of constabulary duty in the Deep South, having been recalled to Fort Abraham Lincoln, Dakota Territory, to reassemble the regiment for the campaign. About 20% of the troopers had been enlisted in the prior 7 months. 139 of an enlisted roll of 718 were only marginally trained and had no combat or frontier experience. About 60% of these recruits were American. The rest were European immigrants. Most were Irish and German, just as many of the veteran troopers had been before their enlistments. Archaeological evidence suggests that many of these troopers were malnourished and in poor physical condition, despite being the best equipped and supplied regiment in the Army. Of the 45 officers and 718 troopers then assigned to the 7th Cavalry, including a second lieutenant detached from the 20th Infantry and serving in Company L, 14 officers, including the regimental commander, and 152 troopers did not accompany the 7th during the campaign. The regimental commander, Colonel Samuel D. Sturgis, was on detached duty as the superintendent of mounted recruiting service and commander of the cavalry depot in St. Louis, Missouri, which left Lieutenant Colonel Custer in command of the regiment. The ratio of troops detached for other duty, approximately 22%, was not unusual for an expedition of this size, and part of the officer shortage was chronic, due to the Army's rigid seniority system. 3 of the regiment's 12 captains were permanently detached, and 2 had never served a day with the 7th since their appointment in July 1866. 3 second lieutenant vacancies in E, H, and L companies were also unfilled. Battle of the Rosebud. The Army's coordination and planning began to go awry on June 17, 1876, when Crook's column retreated after the Battle of the Rosebud, just 30 miles 48 km to the southeast of the eventual Little Bighorn battlefield. Surprised and, according to some accounts, astonished by the unusually large numbers of Native Americans, Crook held the field at the end of the battle, but felt compelled by his losses to pull back, regroup, and wait for reinforcements. Unaware of Crook's battle, Gibbon and Terry proceeded, joining forces in early June near the mouth of Rosebud Creek. They reviewed Terry's plan calling for Custer's regiment to proceed south along the Rosebud while Terry and Gibbon's united forces would move in a westerly direction toward the Bighorn and Little Bighorn Rivers. As this was the likely location of native encampments, all Army elements had been instructed to converge there around June 26 or 27 in an attempt to engulf the Native Americans. On June 22, Terry ordered the 7th Cavalry, composed of 31 officers and 566 enlisted men under Custer, to begin a reconnaissance in force and pursuit along the Rosebud, with the prerogative to depart from orders if Custer saw sufficient reason. Custer had been offered the use of Gatling guns but declined, believing they would slow his rate of march. Little Bighorn. While the Terry-Gibbon column was marching toward the mouth of the Little Bighorn, on the evening of June 24, Custer's Indian scouts arrived at an overlook known as the Crow's Nest, 14 miles 23 km east of the Little Bighorn River. At sunrise on June 25, Custer's scouts reported they could see a massive pony herd and signs of the Native American village roughly 15 miles 24 km in the distance. After a night's march, the tired officer who was sent with the scouts could see neither, and when Custer joined them, he was also unable to make the sighting. Custer's scouts also spotted the regimental cooking fires that could be seen from 10 by 16 km away, disclosing the regiment's position. Custer contemplated a surprise attack against the encampment the following morning of June 26, but he then received a report informing him several hostiles had discovered the trail left by his troops. Assuming his presence had been exposed, Custer decided to attack the village without further delay. On the morning of June 25, Custer divided his 12 companies into 3 battalions in anticipation of the forthcoming engagement. 3 companies were placed under the command of Major Marcus Reno, AG&M, and 3 were placed under the command of Captain Frederick Benteen, HD&K. 5 companies C, E, F, I, and L remained under Custer's immediate command. The 12th Company B under Captain Thomas McDougall had been assigned to escort the slower pack train carrying provisions and additional ammunition. Unknown to Custer, the group of Native Americans seen on his trail was actually leaving the encampment and did not alert the rest of the village. Custer's scouts warned him about the size of the village, with Mitch Bauer reportedly saying, "General, I have been with these Indians for 30 years, and this is the largest village I have ever heard of." Custer's overriding concern was that the Native American group would break up and scatter. The command began its approach to the village at noon and prepared to attack in full daylight. With an impending sense of doom, the Crow scout Half-Yellow Face prophetically warned Custer, speaking through the interpreter Mitch Bauer. Prelude. Military assumptions prior to the battle. Number of Indian warriors. As the Army moved into the field on its expedition, it was operating with incorrect assumptions as to the number of Indians it would encounter. These assumptions were based on inaccurate information provided by the Indian agents that no more than 800 hostiles were in the area. The Indian agents based this estimate on the number of Lakota that Sitting Bull and other leaders had reportedly led off the reservation in protest of U.S. government policies. It was in fact a correct estimate until several weeks before the battle, when the reservation Indians joined Sitting Bull's ranks for the summer buffalo hunt. The agents did not consider the many thousands of these reservation Indians who had unofficially left the reservation to join their uncooperative non-reservation cousins led by Sitting Bull. Thus, Custer unknowingly faced thousands of Indians, including the 800 non-reservation hostiles. All Army plans were based on the incorrect numbers. Although Custer was criticized after the battle for not having accepted reinforcements and for dividing his forces, it appears that he had accepted the same official government estimates of hostiles in the area which Terry and Gibbon. Historian James Donovan notes, however, that when Custer later asked interpreter Fred Gerard for his opinion on the size of the opposition, he estimated the force at between 1,500 to 2,500 warriors. Additionally, Custer was more concerned with preventing the escape of the Lakota and Cheyenne than with fighting them. From his observation, As reported by his bugler John Martin Giovanni Martino, Custer assumed the warriors had been sleeping in on the morning of the battle, to which virtually every native account attested later, giving Custer a false estimate of what he was up against. When he and his scouts first looked down on the village from the crow's nest across the Little Bighorn River, they could only see the herd of ponies. Later, looking from a hill 2+1/2 miles 4 km away after parting with Reno's command, Custer could observe only women preparing for the day, and young boys taking thousands of horses out to graze south of the village. Custer's Crow scouts told him it was the largest native village they had ever seen. When the scouts began changing back into their native dress right before the battle, Custer released them from his command. While the village was enormous, Custer still thought there were far fewer warriors to defend the village. Finally, Custer may have assumed when he encountered the Native Americans that his subordinate Benteen, who was with the pack train, would provide support. Rifle volleys were a standard way of telling supporting units to come to another unit's aid. In a subsequent official 1879 Army investigation requested by Major Reno, the Reno Board of Inquiry Arcoy, Benteen and Reno's men testified that they heard distinct rifle volleys as late as 4:30 p.m. during the battle. Custer had initially wanted to take a day to scout the village before attacking, however. When men went back looking for supplies accidentally dropped by the pack train, they discovered that their track had already been discovered by Indians. Reports from his scouts also revealed fresh pony tracks from ridges overlooking his formation. It became apparent that the warriors in the village were either aware of or would soon be aware of his approach. Fearing that the village would break up into small bands that he would have to chase, Custer began to prepare for an immediate attack. Role of Indian non-combatants in Custer's strategy. Custer's field strategy was designed to engage non-combatants at the encampments on the Little Bighorn to capture women, children, and the elderly or disabled to serve as hostages, to convince the warriors to surrender and comply with federal orders to relocate. Custer's battalions were poised to ride into the camp and secure non-combatant hostages and force the warriors to surrender. Author Evan S. Connell observed that if Custer could occupy the village before widespread resistance developed, the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors would be obliged to surrender because if they started to fight, they would be endangering their families. In Custer's book My Life on the Plains, published 2 years before the Battle of the Little Bighorn, he asserted, "Indians contemplating a battle, either offensive or defensive, are always anxious to have their women and children removed from all danger, danger, yeah, all danger, okay, danger, there is danger." For this reason, I decided to locate our military camp as close as convenient to Chief Black Kettle's Cheyenne village, knowing that the close proximity of their women and children, and their necessary exposure in case of conflict, would operate as a powerful argument in favor of peace, when the question of peace or war came to be discussed. On Custer's decision to advance up the bluffs and descend on the village from the east, Lieutenant Edward Godfrey of Company K surmised, Custer expected to find the squaws and children fleeing to the bluffs on the north, for in no other way do I account for his wide detour. He must have counted upon Reno's success and fully expected the scatteration of the non-combatants with the pony herds. The probable attack upon the families and capture of the herds were in that event counted upon to strike consternation in the hearts of the warriors and were elements for success upon which General Custer fully counted. The Sioux and Cheyenne fighters were acutely aware of the danger posed by the military engagement of non-combatants, and that even a semblance of an attack on the women and children would draw the warriors back to the village, according to historian John S. Gray. Such was their concern that an apparent reconnaissance by Captain Yates E and F companies at the mouth of Medicine Tail, Coulee Minneconjou Ford caused hundreds of warriors to disengage from the Reno Valley fight and return to deal with. Some authors and historians, based on archaeological evidence and reviews of native testimony, speculate that Custer attempted to cross the river at a point further north they refer to as Ford D. According to Richard A. Fox, James Donovan, and others, Custer proceeded with a wing of his battalion Yates troops E and F north and opposite the Cheyenne Circle. At that Yates's force posed an immediate threat to fugitive Indian families. Gathering at the north end of the huge encampment, he then persisted in his efforts to seize women and children even as hundreds of warriors were massing around Keogh's wing on the bluffs. Yates' wing descending to the Little Bighorn River at Ford D encountered light resistance, undetected by the Indian forces ascending the bluffs east of the village. Custer was almost within striking distance of the refugees before abandoning the ford and returning to Custer Ridge. Lone Teepee. The Lone Teepee, or Teepee, was a landmark along the 7th Cavalry's march. It was where the Indian encampment had been a week earlier, during the Battle of the Rosebud on June 17, 1876. The Indians had left a single teepee standing. Some reports mention a second that had been partially dismantled, and in it was the body of a Sans Arc warrior, Old She Bear, who had been wounded in the battle. He had died a couple of days after the Rosebud battle, and it was the custom of the Indians to move camp when a warrior died and leave the body with its possessions. The Lone Teepee was an important location during the Battle of the Little Bighorn for several reasons, including it is where Custer gave Reno his final orders to attack the village ahead. It is also where some Indians who had been following the command were seen, and Custer assumed he had been discovered. Many of the survivors' accounts use the Lone Teepee as a point of reference for event times or distances. Knowing this location helps establish the pattern of the Indians' movements to the encampment on the river where the soldiers found them. Battle. Reno's attack. The first group to attack was Major Reno's 2nd Detachment Companies A, G, and M after receiving orders from Custer written out by Lieutenant William W. Cook. As Custer's Crow scouts reported, Sioux tribe members were alerting the village. Ordered to charge, Reno began that phase of the battle. The orders, made without accurate knowledge of the village size, location, or the warriors' propensity to stand and fight, had been to pursue the Native Americans and bring them to battle. Reno's force crossed the Little Bighorn at the mouth of what is today Reno Creek around 3:00 p.m. on June 25. They immediately realized that the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne were present in force and not running away. Reno advanced rapidly across the open field towards the northwest, his movements masked by the thick bramble of trees that ran along the southern banks of the Little Bighorn River. The same trees on his front right shielded his movements across the wide field over which his men rapidly rode, first with 2 approximately 40-man companies abreast, and eventually with all 3 charging abreast. The trees also obscured Reno's view of the Native American village until his force had passed that bend on his right front and was suddenly within arrow shot of the village. The tepees in that area were occupied by the Hunkpapa Sioux. Neither Custer nor Reno had much idea of the length, depth, and size of the encampment. They were attacking as the village was hidden by the trees. When Reno came into the open in front of the south end of the village, he sent his Arikara/Re and Crow Indian scouts forward on his exposed left flank. Realizing the full extent of the village's width, Reno quickly suspected what he would later call a trap and stopped a few hundred yards short of the encampment. He ordered his troopers to dismount and deploy in a skirmish line, according to standard Army doctrine. In this formation, every 4th trooper held the horses for the troopers in firing position, with 5 to 10 yards 5 to 9 in separating each trooper, officers to their rear and troopers with horses behind the officers. This formation reduced Reno's firepower by 25%. As Reno's men fired into the village and killed, by some accounts, several wives and children of the Sioux leader, Chief Gall in Lakota, Fizzy, the mounted warriors began streaming out to meet the attack. With Reno's men anchored on their right by the protection of the tree line and bend in the river, the Indians rode against the center and exposed left end of Reno's line. After about 20 minutes of long-distance firing, Reno had taken only one casualty, but the odds against him had risen. Reno estimated 5-1, and Custer had not reinforced him. Trooper Billy Jackson reported that by then the Indians had begun massing in the open area shielded by a small hill to the left of Reno's line and to the right of the Indian village. From this position the Indians mounted an attack of more than 500 warriors against the left and rear of Reno's line, turning Reno's exposed left flank. This forced a hasty withdrawal into the timber along the bend in the river. Here the Native Americans pinned Reno and his men down and tried to set fire to the brush to try to drive the soldiers out of their position. Reno's Arikara scout, Bloody Knife, was shot in the head. The shaken Reno ordered his men to dismount and mount again. He then said, "All those who wish to make their escape follow me." Abandoning the wounded, dooming them to their deaths, he led a disorderly route for a mile next to the river. He made no attempt to engage the Indians to prevent them from picking off men in the rear. The retreat was immediately disrupted by Cheyenne attacks at close quarters. A steep bank, some 8 feet (2.4 m) high, awaited the mounted men as they crossed the river. Some horses fell back onto others below them. Indians both fired on the soldiers from a distance, and within close quarters pulled them off their horses and clubbed their heads. Later, Reno reported that 3 officers and 29 troopers had been killed during the retreat and subsequent fording of the river. Another officer and 18 men were missing. Most of these missing men were left behind in the timber, although many eventually rejoined the detachment. Reno and Benteen on Reno Hill. Atop the bluffs known today as Reno Hill, Reno's depleted and shaken troops were joined about a half-hour later by Captain Benteen's column companies D, H, and K arriving from the south. This force had been returning from a lateral scouting mission when it had been summoned by Custer's messenger, Italian bugler John Martin Giovanni Martino, with the handwritten message: Benteen, come on, big village, be quick, bring packs. P.S. Bring packs. This message made no sense to Benteen, as his men would be needed more in a fight than the packs carried by herd animals. Though both men inferred that Custer was engaged in battle, Reno refused to move until the packs arrived so his men could resupply. The detachments were later reinforced by McDougall's Company B and the pack train. The 14 officers and 340 troopers on the bluffs organized an all-round defense and dug rifle pits using whatever implements they had among them, including knives. This practice had become standard during the last year of the American Civil War, with both Union and Confederate troops utilizing knives, eating utensils, mess plates, and pans to dig effective battlefield fortifications. Despite hearing heavy gunfire from the north, including distinct volleys at 4:20 p.m., Benteen concentrated on reinforcing Reno's badly wounded and hard-pressed detachment rather than continuing on toward Custer's position. Benteen's apparent reluctance to reach Custer prompted later criticism that he had failed to follow orders. Around 5:00 p.m., Captain Thomas Weir and Company D moved out to contact Custer. They advanced a mile to what is today Weir Ridge or Weir Point. Weir could see that the Indian camps comprised some 1,800 lodges. Behind them he saw through the dust and smoke hills that were oddly red in color. He later learned that this was a massive assemblage of Indian ponies. By this time, roughly 5:25 p.m., Custer's battle may have concluded. Weir witnessed Indians shooting, perhaps killing wounded soldiers and firing at dead bodies on the last stand hill at the northern end of the Custer battlefield. Some historians have suggested that what Weir witnessed was a fight on what is now called Calhoun Hill some minutes earlier. The destruction of Keogh's battalion may have begun with the collapse of Linc Company, half of it following the combined assaults led by Crazy Horse, White Bull, Hump, Chief Gall, and others. Other native accounts contradict this understanding, however, and the time element remains a subject of debate. The other entrenched companies eventually left Reno Hill and followed Weir by assigned battalions, first Benteen, then Reno, and finally the pack train. The men on Weir Ridge were attacked by natives, increasingly coming from the apparently concluded Custer engagement, forcing all 7 companies to return to the bluff before the pack train had moved even a quarter mile 400 m. The companies remained pinned down on the bluff, fending off the Indians for 3 hours until night fell. The soldiers dug crude trenches as the Indians performed their war dance. Benteen was hit in the heel of his boot by an Indian bullet. At one point, he led a counterattack to push back Indians who had continued to crawl through the grass closer to the soldiers' positions. Custer's fight. The precise details of Custer's fight are largely conjectural, since none of the men who went forward with Custer's battalion, the 5 companies under his immediate command, survived the battle. Later accounts from surviving Indians are useful, but are sometimes conflicting and unclear. While the gunfire heard on the bluffs by Reno and Benteen's men during the afternoon of June 25 was probably from Custer's fight, the soldiers on Reno Hill were unaware of what had happened to Custer until General Terry's arrival 2 days later on June 27. They were reportedly stunned by the news. When the army examined the Custer battle site, soldiers could not determine fully what had transpired. Custer's force of roughly 210 men had been engaged by the Lakota and northern Cheyenne about 3.5 miles 5.6 km to the north of Reno and Benteen's defensive position. Evidence of organized resistance included an apparent skirmish line on Calhoun Hill and apparent breastworks made of dead horses on Custer Hill. By the time troops came to recover the bodies, the Lakota and Cheyenne had already removed most of their dead from the field. The troops found most of Custer's dead men stripped of their clothing, ritually mutilated and in a state of decomposition, making identification of many impossible. The soldiers identified the 7th Cavalry's dead as best as possible and hastily buried them where they fell. Custer's body was found with 2 gunshot wounds, one to his left chest and the other to his left temple. Either wound would have been fatal, though he appeared to have bled from only the chest wound. Some scholars believe his head wound may have been delivered post-mortem. Some Lakota oral histories assert that Custer, having sustained a wound, committed suicide to avoid capture and subsequent torture. This would be inconsistent with his known right-handedness, but that does not rule out assisted suicide. Other native accounts note several soldiers committing suicide near the end of the battle. Custer's body was found near the top of Custer Hill, which also came to be known as Last Stand Hill. There the United States erected a tall memorial obelisk inscribed with the names of the 7th Cavalry's casualties. Several days after the battle, Curley, Custer's Crow scout, who had left Custer near Medicine Tail Coulee, a drainage which led to the river, recounted the battle, reporting that Custer had attacked the village after attempting to cross the river. He was driven back, retreating toward the hill where his body was found. As the scenario seemed compatible with Custer's aggressive style of warfare, and with evidence found on the ground, it became the basis of many popular accounts of the battle. According to Pretty Shield, the wife of goes ahead another Crow scout for the 7th Cavalry, Custer was killed while crossing the river. In this account, Custer was allegedly killed by a Lakota called Big Nose. However, in Chief Gall's version of events, as recounted to Lieutenant Edward Settle Godfrey, Custer did not attempt to ford the river, and the nearest that he came to the river or village was his final position on the ridge. Chief Gall's statements were corroborated by other Indians, notably the wife of Spotted Horn Bull. Given that no bodies of men or horses were found anywhere near the ford, Godfrey himself concluded that Custer did not go to the ford with any body of men. Cheyenne oral tradition credits Buffalo Calf Road woman with striking the blow that knocked Custer off his horse before he died. Custer at Minneconjou Ford. Having isolated Reno's force and driven them away from their encampment, the bulk of the native warriors were free to pursue Custer. The route taken by Custer to his last stand remains a subject of debate. One possibility is that after ordering Reno to charge, Custer continued down Reno Creek to within about a half-mile 800 m of the Little Bighorn, but then turned north and climbed up the bluffs, reaching the same spot to which Reno would soon retreat. From this point on the other side of the river, he could see Reno charging the village. Riding north along the bluffs, Custer could have descended into Medicine Tail Coulee. Some historians believe that part of Custer's force descended the coulee, going west to the river and attempting unsuccessfully to cross into the village. According to some accounts, a small contingent of Indian sharpshooters effectively opposed this crossing. White Cowbull claimed to have shot a leader wearing a buckskin jacket off his horse in the river. While no other Indian account supports this claim, if White Bull did shoot a buckskin-clad leader off his horse, some historians have argued that Custer may have been seriously wounded by him. Some Indian accounts claim that besides wounding one of the leaders of this advance, a soldier carrying a company guidon was also hit. Troopers had to dismount to help the wounded men back onto their horses. The fact that either of the non-mutilation wounds to Custer's body, a bullet wound below the heart and a shot to the left temple, would have been instantly fatal casts doubt on his being wounded and remounted. Reports of an attempted fording of the river at Medicine Tail Coulee might explain Custer's purpose for Reno's attack, that is, a coordinated hammer and anvil maneuver, with Reno's holding the Indians at bay at the southern end of the camp, while Custer drove them against Reno's line from the north. Other historians have noted that if Custer did attempt to cross the river near Medicine Tail Coulee, he may have believed it was the north end of the Indian camp, only to discover that it was the middle. Some Indian accounts, however, place the northern Cheyenne encampment and the north end of the overall village to the left and south of the opposite side of the crossing. The precise location of the north end of the village remains in dispute, however. In 1908, Edward Curtis, the famed ethnologist and photographer of the Native American Indians, made a detailed personal study of the battle, interviewing many of those who had fought or taken part in it. First, he went over the ground covered by the troops with the 3 Crow scouts. White Man Runs Him, Goes Ahead, and Harry Moccasin, and then again with 2 Moons and a party of Cheyenne warriors. He also visited the Lakota country and interviewed Red Hawk, whose recollection of the fight seemed to be particularly clear. Then he went over the battlefield once more with the 3 Crow scouts, but also accompanied by General Charles Woodruff, as I particularly desired that the testimony of these men might be considered by an experienced army officer. Finally, Curtis visited the country of the Arikara and interviewed the scouts of that tribe who had been with Custer's command. Based on all the information he gathered, Curtis concluded that Custer had indeed ridden down the Medicine Tail Coulee and then towards the river, where he probably planned to ford it. However, the Indians had now discovered him and were gathered closely on the opposite side. They were soon joined by a large force of Sioux who, no longer engaging Reno, rushed down the valley. This was the beginning of their attack on Custer, who was forced to turn and head for the hill where he would make his famous last stand. Thus, wrote Curtis, Custer made no attack, the whole movement being a retreat. Other views of Custer's actions at Minneconjou Ford. Last stand. In the end, the hilltop to which Custer had moved was probably too small to accommodate all of the survivors and wounded. Fire from the southeast made it impossible for Custer's men to secure a defensive position all around Last Stand Hill, where the soldiers put up their most dogged defense. According to Lakota accounts, far more of their casualties occurred in the attack on Last Stand Hill than anywhere else. The extent of the soldiers' resistance indicated they had few doubts about their prospects for survival. According to Cheyenne and Sioux testimony, the command structure rapidly broke down, although smaller last stands were apparently made by several groups. Custer's remaining companies EF and half of C were soon killed. By almost all accounts, the Lakota annihilated Custer's force within an hour of engagement. David Humphreys Miller, who between 1935 and 1955 interviewed the last Lakota survivors of the battle, wrote that the Custer fight lasted less than 1/2 hour. Other native accounts said the fighting lasted only as long as it takes a hungry man to eat a meal. The Lakota asserted that Crazy Horse personally led one of the large groups of warriors who overwhelmed the cavalrymen in a surprise charge from the northeast, causing a breakdown in the command structure and panic among the troops. Many of these men threw down their weapons while Cheyenne and Sioux warriors rode them down, counting coup with lances, coup sticks, and quirts. Some native accounts recalled this segment of the fight as a buffalo run. Captain Frederick Benteen, battalion leader of companies D, H, and K, recalled his observations on the Custer battlefield on June 27, 1876. I went over the battlefield carefully with a view to determine how the battle was fought. I arrived at the conclusion I hold now, that it was a rout, a panic, until the last man was killed. It was killed, it was killed, it was killed, it was killed, and killed. There was no line formed on the battlefield. You can take a handful of corn and scatter the kernels over the floor, and make just such lines. There were none, there were none, none. The only approach to a line was where 5 or 6 dead horses found at equal distances, like skirmishers, part of Lieutenant Calhoun's Company L. That was the only approach to a line on the field. There were more than 20 troopers killed in one group. There were more often 4 or 5 at one place, all within a space of 20 to 30 yards of each other, each other, each other, each other, each other. I counted 70 dead cavalry horses and 2 Indian ponies. I think in all probability that the men turned their horses loose without any orders to do so. Many orders might have been given, but few obeyed. I think that they were panic-stricken. It was a rout, as I said before. A Brule Sioux warrior stated, in fact, Hollow Hornbear believed that the troops were in good order at the start of the fight, and kept their organization even while moving from point to point. Red Horse, an Oglala Sioux warrior, commented, "Here last Stand Hill the soldiers made a desperate fight." One Huntpapa Sioux warrior, Moving Robe, noted that it was a hotly contested battle, while another, Iron Hawk, stated, "The Indians pressed and crowded right in around Custer Hill. But the soldiers weren't ready to die. We stood there a long time." In a letter from February 21, 1910, Private William Taylor, Company M 7th Cavalry, wrote, "Reno proved incompetent and Benteen showed his indifference. I will not use the uglier words that have often been in my mind. Both failed Custer, and he had to fight it out alone." Custer's final resistance. Recent archaeological work at the battlefield indicates that officers on Custer Hill restored some tactical control. E Company rushed off Custer Hill toward the Little Bighorn River, but failed to reach it, which resulted in the destruction of that company. This left about 60 men, mostly from F Company and the staff, on Last Stand Hill. The remainder of the battle took on the nature of a running fight. Modern archaeology and historical Indian accounts indicate that Custer's force may have been divided into 3 groups, with the Indians attempting to prevent them from effectively reuniting. Indian accounts describe warriors, including women, running up from the village to wave blankets in order to scare off the soldiers' horses. One 7th Cavalry trooper claimed to have found several stone mallets consisting of a round cobble weighing 8–10 pounds, about 4 kg, with a rawhide handle, which he believed had been used by the Indian women to finish off the wounded. Fighting dismounted, the soldiers' skirmish lines were overwhelmed. Army doctrine would have called for 1 man in 4 to be a horseholder behind the skirmish lines, and in extreme cases, 1 man in 8. Later, the troops would have bunched together in defensive positions and are alleged to have shot their remaining horses as cover. As individual troopers were wounded or killed, initial defensive positions would have been abandoned as untenable. Under threat of attack, the first U.S. soldiers on the battlefield. A couple of years after the battle, markers were placed where men were believed to have fallen, so the placement of troops has been roughly construed. The troops evidently died in several groups, including on Custer Hill, around Captain Miles Keogh, and strung out towards the Little Bighorn River. Last breakout attempt. According to Indian accounts, about 40 men on Custer Hill made a desperate stand around Custer, delivering volley fire. The great majority of the Indian casualties were probably suffered during this closing segment of the battle, as the soldiers and Indians on Calhoun Ridge were more widely separated and traded fire at greater distances for most of their portion of the battle than did the soldiers and Indians on Custer Hill. Modern documentaries suggest that there may not have been a last stand, as traditionally portrayed in popular culture. Instead, archaeologists suggest that in the end, this scenario corresponds to several Indian accounts stating crazy horses charge swarmed the resistance, with the surviving soldiers fleeing in panic. Many of these troopers may have ended up in a deep ravine 300 to 400 yards, 270 to 370 m away from what is known today as Custer Hill. At least 28 bodies, the most common number associated with burial witness testimony, including that of Scout Mitch Bower, were discovered in or near that gulch, their deaths possibly the battle's final actions. Although the marker for Mitch Bower was found accurate through archaeological and forensic testing of remains, it is some 65 yards away from Deep Ravine. Historian Douglas Scott theorized that the Deep Gulch or Deep Ravine might have included not only the steep-sided portion of the coulee, but the entire drainage including its tributaries, in which case the bodies of Bower and others were found where eyewitnesses had said they were seen. Other archaeological explorations done in Deep Ravine found no human remains associated with the battle. Over the years since the battle, skeletal remains that were reportedly recovered from the mouth of the Deep Ravine by various sources have been repatriated to the Little Bighorn National Monument. According to Scott, it is likely that in the 108 years between the battle and Scott's excavation efforts in the ravine, geological processes caused many of the remains to become unrecoverable. For example, near the town of Garryowen, portions of the skeleton of a trooper killed in the Reno retreat were recovered from an eroding bank of the Little Bighorn, while the rest of the remains had apparently been washed away by the river. Aftermath. After the Custer force was soundly defeated, the Lakota and Northern Cheyenne regrouped to attack Reno and Benteen. The fight continued until dark, approximately 9:00 p.m. and for much of the next day, with the outcome in doubt. Reno credited Benteen's luck with repulsing a severe attack on the portion of the perimeter held by Companies H and M. On June 27, the column under General Terry approached from the north, and the natives drew off in the opposite direction. The Crow scout white man runs him was the first to tell General Terry's officers that Custer's force had been wiped out. Reno and Benteen's wounded troops were given what treatment was available at that time. 5 later died of their wounds. One of the regiment's 3 surgeons had been with Custer's column, while another, Dr. DeWolf, had been killed during Reno's retreat. The only remaining doctor was Assistant Surgeon Henry R. Porter. The first to hear the news of the Custer disaster were those aboard the steamboat Far West, which had brought supplies for the expedition. Curley, one of Custer's scouts, rode up to the steamboat and tearfully conveyed the information to Grant Marsh, the boat's captain, and Army officers. Marsh converted the Far West into a floating field hospital to carry the 52 wounded from the battle to Fort Lincoln. Traveling night and day, with a full head of steam, Marsh brought the steamer downriver to Bismarck, Dakota Territory, making the 710-mile 1140 km run in the record time of 54 hours, and bringing the first news of the military defeat, which came to be popularly known as the Custer Massacre. The editor of the Bismarck paper kept the telegraph operator busy for hours transmitting information to the New York Herald, for which he corresponded. News of the defeat arrived in the East as the U.S. was observing its centennial. The Army began to investigate, although its effectiveness was hampered by a concern for survivors and the reputation of the officers. Custer's wife, Elizabeth Bacon Custer, in particular, guarded and promoted the ideal of him as the gallant hero, attacking any who cast an ill light on his reputation. The Battle of the Little Bighorn had far-reaching consequences for the natives. It was the beginning of the end of the Indian Wars, and has even been referred to as the Indians' last stand in the area. Within 48 hours of the battle, the large encampment on the Little Bighorn broke up into smaller groups, because there was not enough game and grass to sustain a large congregation of people and horses. Oglala Sioux Black Elk recounted the exodus this way: "We fled all night following the Greasy Grass. My two younger brothers and I rode in a pony drag, and my mother put some young pups in with us. They were always trying to crawl out, and I was always putting them back in. So I didn't sleep much. The scattered Sioux and Cheyenne feasted. After their celebrations, many of the natives returned to the reservation. Soon the number of warriors amounted to only about 600. Both Crook and Terry remained immobile for 7 weeks after the battle, awaiting reinforcements and unwilling to venture out against the Sioux and Cheyenne until they had at least 2,000 men. Crook and Terry finally took the field against the native forces in August. General Nelson A. Miles took command of the effort in October 1876. In May 1877, Sitting Bull escaped to Canada. Within days, Crazy Horse surrendered at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The Great Sioux War ended on May 7 with Miles' defeat of a remaining band of Minneconjou Sioux. Ownership of the Black Hills, which had been a focal point of the 1876 conflict, was determined by an ultimatum issued by the Manipani Commission, according to which the Sioux were required to cede the land to the United States if they wanted the government to continue supplying rations to the reservations. Threatened with forced starvation, the natives ceded Pahasapa to the United States, but the Sioux never accepted the legitimacy of the transaction. They lobbied Congress to create a forum to decide their claim and subsequently litigated for 40 years. The United States Supreme Court, in the 1980 decision United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians, acknowledged that the United States had taken the Black Hills without just compensation. The Sioux refused the money subsequently offered and continued to insist on their right to occupy the land. When the Crows got news from the battlefield, they went into grief. Crow woman Pretty Shield told how they were crying. With the defeat of Custer, it was still a real threat that the Lakotas would take over the eastern part of the Crow Reservation and keep up the invasion. In the end, the Army won the Sioux War. Crow Chief Plenty Coups recalled with amazement how his tribe now finally could sleep without fear for Lakota attacks. "This was the first time I had ever known such a condition." Participants. 7th Cavalry officers. Commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, killed. Major Marcus Reno. Adjutant, First Lieutenant William W. Cook, killed. Assistant Surgeon George Edwin Lord, killed. Acting Assistant Surgeon James Madison DeWolf, killed. Acting Assistant Surgeon Henry Rinaldo Porter. Chief of Scouts, 2nd Lieutenant Charles Varnum, detached from a company, wounded. Second in command of Scouts, 2nd Lieutenant Luther Hare, detached from K Company. Pack Train Commander, 1st Lieutenant Edward Gustave Matthey, detached from M Company. A Company Captain Miles Moylan, 1st Lieutenant Charles DeRudio. B Company Captain Thomas McDougall, 2nd Lieutenant Benjamin Hodgson, killed as adjutant to Major Reno. C Company Captain Thomas Custer, killed. 2nd Lieutenant Henry Moore Harrington, killed. D Company Captain Thomas Weir, 2nd Lieutenant Winfield Edgerly. E Company 1st Lieutenant Algernon Smith, killed. 2nd Lieutenant James G. Sturgis, killed. F Company Captain George Yates, killed. 2nd Lieutenant William Rayleigh, killed. G Company 1st Lieutenant Donald McIntosh, killed. 2nd Lieutenant George D. Wallace. H Company Captain Frederick Benteen, 1st Lieutenant Francis Gibson. I Company Captain Miles Keogh, killed. 1st Lieutenant James Porter, killed. K Company 1st Lieutenant Edward Settle Godfrey. L Company 1st Lieutenant James Calhoun, killed. 2nd Lieutenant John J. Crittenden, killed. M Company Captain Thomas French. Native American leaders and warriors. The English term warriors is used for convenience. However, the term easily leads to misconceptions and mistranslations, such as the vision of soldiers falling into his camp. The Lakota had formed a Strongheart Society of caretakers and providers for the camp consisting of men who had demonstrated compassion, generosity, and bravery. As the purpose of the tribe's gathering was to take counsel, they did not constitute an army or warrior class. Hunkpapa Lakota, Sitting Bull, Four Horns, Crow King, Chief Gall, Black Moon, Rain in the Face, Moving Robe Woman, Spotted Horn Bull, Iron Hawk, One Bull, Bullhead, Chasing Eagle, Little Big Man, Sihasapa Blackfoot Lakota, Crawler, Kill Eagle, Minneconjou Lakota, Chief Hump, Black Moon, Red Horse, Makes Room, Looks Up, Lame Deer, Dog with Horn, Dog Backbone, White Bull, Feather Earring Flying By, Sans Arc Lakota, Spotted Eagle, Red Bear, Long Road, Cloud Man, Oglala Lakota, Crazy Horse, He Dog, Kicking Bear, Flying Hawk, Chief Long Wolf, Black Elk, White Cow Bull, Running Eagle, Black Fox Roman 2, Brule Lakota, Two Eagles, Hollow Horn Bear, Brave Bird, Two Kettles Lakota, Runs the Enemy, Lower Yanktonai Dakota, Thunder Bear, Medicine Cloud, Iron Bear, Long Tree, Wapakute Dakota, Inkpajuta, Sounds the Ground as He Walks, White Eagle, White Tracking Earth, Black Powder, Sioux Firearms Trader, Black Powder, Johann Smith, Northern Cheyenne, Two Moons, Wooden Leg, Old Bear, Lame White Man, American Horse, Brave Wolf, Antelope Women, Thunder Bull, Big Nose, Yellow Horse, Little Shield, Horse Road, Bobtail Horse, Yellow Hair, Bear Walks on a Ridge, Black Hawk, Buffalo Calf Road Woman, Crooked Nose, Noisy Walking, Arapahoes, Waterman, Sage, Left Hand, Yellow Eagle, Little Bird, Bird. Arapaho participation. Modern-day accounts include Arapaho warriors in the battle, but the 5 Arapaho men who were at the encampments were there only by accident. While on a hunting trip, they came close to the village by the river and were captured and almost killed by the Lakota who believed the hunters were scouts for the U.S. Army. Two Moons, a Northern Cheyenne leader, interceded to save their lives. Notable scouts/interpreters. The 7th Cavalry was accompanied by a number of scouts and interpreters. Bloody Knife, Arikara/Lakota scout killed. Bob-tailed Bull, Arikara scout killed. Boy Chief, Arikara scout. Charlie Reynolds scout killed. Cout killed. Curly, Crow scout. Curling Head, Arikara scout. Fred Gerard, interpreter. Gerard, interpreter. Gerard, interpreter. Gerard, interpreter. Goes ahead, Crow scout. Goose, Arikara scout wounded in the hand by a 7th Cavalry trooper. Harry Moccasin, Crow scout. Half Yellow Face, leader of Crow Scouts, also known as paints half his face yellow. Isaiah Dorman, interpreter killed. Little Brave, Arikara scout killed. Little Sioux, Arikara scout. Mitch Bauer, scout/interpreter killed. One Feather, Arikara scout. Al, Arikara scout. Peter Jackson, half Pecuni and half Blackfoot, brother of William Scout. Red Bear, Arikara scout. Red Star, Arikara scout. Running Wolf, Arikara scout. Sitting Bear, Arikara scout. Soldier, Arikara scout. Strikes the Lodge, Arikara scout. Strikes 2, Arikara scout. Two Moons, Arikara/Shara/Cheyenne scout. White Man runs him, Crow scout. White Swan, Crow scout severely wounded. William Jackson, half Pecuni and half Blackfoot scout. Young Hawk, Arikara scout. Order of battle. Native Americans. United States Army, Lieutenant Colonel George A. Custer, 7th United States Cavalry Regiment, commanding. Casualties. Native American warriors. Estimates of Native American casualties have differed widely, from as few as 36 dead from Native American listings of the dead by name to as many as 300. Lakota Chief Red Horse told Colonel W. H. Wood in 1877 that the Native Americans suffered 136 dead and 160 wounded during the battle. In 1881, Red Horse told Dr. C. E. McChesney the same numbers, but in a series of drawings done by Red Horse to illustrate the battle, he drew only 60 figures representing Lakota and Cheyenne casualties. Of those 60 figures, only 30-some are portrayed with a conventional Plains Indian method of indicating death. In the last 140 years, historians have been able to identify multiple Indian names pertaining to the same individual, which has greatly reduced previously inflated numbers. Today, a list of positively known casualties exists that lists 99 names, attributed and consolidated. Native American noncombatants, 6 unnamed Native American women and 4 unnamed children are known to have been killed at the beginning of the battle during Reno's charge. Among them were 2 wives and 3 children of the Hunkpapa leader Gall. 7th Cavalry. The 7th Cavalry suffered 52% casualties, 16 officers and 242 troopers killed or died of wounds, 1 officer and 51 troopers wounded. Every soldier of the 5 companies with Custer was killed except for some Crow scouts and several troopers that had left that column before the battle or as the battle was starting. Among the dead were Custer's brothers Boston and Thomas, his brother-in-law James Calhoun, and his nephew Henry Reed. In 1878, the Army awarded 24 medals of honor to participants in the fight on the bluffs for bravery, most for risking their lives to carry water from the river up the hill to the wounded. Few on the non-Indian side questioned the conduct of the enlisted men, but many questioned the tactics, strategy, and conduct of the officers. Indian accounts spoke of soldiers' panic-driven flight and suicide by those unwilling to fall captive to the Indians. While such stories were gathered by Thomas Bailey Marquis in a book in the 1930s, it was not published until 1976 because of the unpopularity of such assertions. Although soldiers may have believed captives would be tortured, Indians usually killed men outright and took as captive for adoption only young women and children. Indian accounts also noted the bravery of soldiers who fought to the death. Civilians killed armed and embedded within the Army. Boston Custer, brother of George and Thomas, forager for the 7th. Mark Kellogg, reporter. Henry Armstrong Reed, Custer's nephew, herder for the 7th. Legacy. Reconstitution of the 7th Cavalry. Beginning in July, the 7th Cavalry was assigned new officers and recruiting efforts began to fill the depleted ranks. The regiment, reorganized into 8 companies, remained in the field as part of the Terry expedition, now based on the Yellowstone River at the mouth of the Bighorn and reinforced by Gibbon's column. On August 8, 1876, after Terry was further reinforced with the 5th Infantry, the expedition moved up Rosebud Creek in pursuit of the Lakota. It met with Crook's command, similarly reinforced, and the combined force, almost 4,000 strong, followed the Lakota Trail northeast toward the Little Missouri River. Persistent rain and lack of supplies forced the column to dissolve and return to its varying starting points. The 7th Cavalry returned to Fort Abraham Lincoln to reconstitute. The regimental commander, Colonel Samuel D. Sturgis, returned from his detached duty in St. Louis, Missouri. Sturgis led the 7th Cavalry in the campaign against the Nez Perce in 1877. Expansion of the U.S. Army. The U.S. Congress authorized appropriations to expand the Army by 2,500 men to meet the emergency after the defeat of the 7th Cavalry. For a session, The Democratic Party-controlled House of Representatives abandoned its campaign to reduce the size of the Army. Word of Custer's fate reached the 44th United States Congress as a conference committee was attempting to reconcile opposing appropriations bills approved by the House and the Republican Senate. They approved a measure to increase the size of cavalry companies to 100 enlisted men on July 24. The committee temporarily lifted the ceiling on the size of the Army by 2,500 on August 15. Sell or starve. As a result of the defeat in June 1876, Congress responded by attaching what the Sioux call the Sell or Starve Rider 19 Stat. 192 to the Indian Appropriations Act of 1876 enacted August 15, 1876, which cut off all rations for the Sioux until they terminated hostilities, and c. the Agreement of 1877 19 Stat. 254, enacted February 28, 1877, officially took away Sioux land and permanently established Indian reservations. Controversies. Reno's conduct. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was the subject of an 1879 U.S. Army Court of Inquiry in Chicago, held at Reno's request, during which his conduct was scrutinized. Some testimony by non-Army officers suggested that he was drunk and a coward. The court found Reno's conduct to be without fault. After the battle, Thomas Rosser, James O'Kelly, and others continued to question the conduct of Reno due to his hastily ordered retreat. Defenders of Reno at the trial noted that while the retreat was disorganized, Reno did not withdraw from his position until it became apparent that he was outnumbered and outflanked by the Indians. Contemporary accounts also point to the fact that Reno's scout, Bloody Knife, was shot in the head. Custer's errors. General Terry and others claimed that Custer made strategic errors from the start of the campaign. For instance, he refused to use a battery of Gatling guns and turned down General Terry's offer of an additional battalion of the 2nd Cavalry. Custer believed that the Gatling guns would impede his march up the Rosebud and hamper his mobility. His rapid march en route to the Little Bighorn averaged nearly 30 miles 48 km a day, so his assessment appears to have been accurate. Custer planned to live and travel like Indians. In this manner, the command will be able to go wherever the Indians can, he wrote in his Herald Dispatch. By contrast, each Gatling gun had to be hauled by 4 horses, and soldiers often had to drag the heavy guns by hand over obstacles. Each of the heavy hand-cranked weapons could fire up to 350 rounds a minute, an impressive rate, but they were known to jam frequently. During the Black Hills expedition 2 years earlier, a Gatling gun had turned over, rolled down a mountain, and shattered to pieces. Lieutenant William Lowe, commander of the artillery detachment, was said to have almost wept when he learned he had been excluded from the strike force. Custer believed that the 7th Cavalry could handle any Indian force and that the addition of the 4 companies of the 2nd would not alter the outcome. When offered the 2nd Cavalry, he reportedly replied that the 7th could handle anything. There is evidence that Custer suspected that he would be outnumbered by the Indians, although he did not know by how much. By dividing his forces, Custer could have caused the defeat of the entire column, had it not been for Benteen's and Reno's linking up to make a desperate yet successful stand on the bluff above the southern end of the camp. The historian James Donovan believed that Custer's dividing his force into 4 smaller detachments, including the pack train, can be attributed to his inadequate reconnaissance. He also ignored the warnings of his Crow scouts and Charlie Reynolds. By the time the battle began, Custer had already divided his forces into 3 battalions of differing sizes, of which he kept the largest. His men were widely scattered and unable to support each other, wanting to prevent any escape by the combined tribes to the south. Admiration for Custer. Criticism of Custer was not universal. While investigating the battlefield, Lieutenant General Nelson A. Miles wrote in 1877, "The more I study the moves here on the Little Bighorn, the more I have admiration for Custer. Facing major budget cutbacks, The U.S. Army wanted to avoid bad press and found ways to exculpate Custer. They blamed the defeat on the Indians' alleged possession of numerous repeating rifles and the overwhelming numerical superiority of the warriors. The widowed Elizabeth Bacon Custer, who never remarried, wrote 3 popular books in which she fiercely protected her husband's reputation. She lived until 1933, hindering much serious research until most of the evidence was long gone. In addition, Captain Frederick Whittaker's 1876 book Idealizing Custer was hugely successful. Custer, as a heroic officer fighting valiantly against savage forces, was an image popularized in Wild West extravaganzas hosted by showman Buffalo Bill Cody, Pawnee Bill, and others. It was not until over half a century later. Gatling gun controversy. General Alfred Terry's Dakota column included a single battery of artillery comprising 2 3-inch ordnance rifle and 2 Gatling guns. According to historian Evan S. Connell, the precise number of Gatlings has not been established, either 2 or 3. Custer's decision to reject Terry's offer of the rapid-fire Gatlings has raised questions among historians as to why he refused them and what advantage their availability might have conferred on his forces at the Battle of the Little Big. One factor concerned Major Marcus Reno's recent 8-day reconnaissance in force of the Powdertongue Rosebud Rivers, June 10 to 18. This deployment had demonstrated that artillery pieces mounted on gun carriages and hauled by horses no longer fit for cavalry mounts, so-called condemned horses, were cumbersome over mixed terrain and vulnerable to breakdown. Custer, valuing the mobility of the 7th Cavalry and recognizing Terry's acknowledgment of the regiment as the primary strike force, preferred to remain unencumbered by the Gatling guns. Custer insisted that the artillery was superfluous to his success, in that the 7th Cavalry alone was sufficient to cope with any force they should encounter, informing Terry, "The 7th can handle anything it meets." In addition to these practical concerns, a strained relationship with Major James Brisbane induced Custer's polite refusal. Historians have acknowledged the firepower inherent in the Gatling gun. They were capable of firing 350 45 70 11 18 mm caliber rounds per minute. Jamming caused by black powder residue could lower that rate, raising questions as to their reliability under combat conditions. Researchers have further questioned the effectiveness of the guns under the tactics that Custer was likely to face with the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. The Gatlings, mounted high on carriages, required the battery crew to stand upright during its operation, making them easy targets for Lakota and Cheyenne sharpshooters. Historian Robert M. Utley, in a section entitled "Would Gatling Guns Have Saved Custer?", presents 2 judgments from Custer's contemporaries. General Henry J. Hunt, expert in the tactical use of artillery in Civil War, stated that Gatlings would probably have saved the command, whereas General Nelson A. Miles, participant in the Great Sioux War. Weapons. Lakota and Cheyenne. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors that opposed Custer's forces possessed a wide array of weaponry, from war clubs and lances to the most advanced firearms of the day. The typical firearms carried by the Lakota and Cheyenne combatants were muzzle-loaders, more often a cap-lock smoothbore, the so-called Indian trade musket, or lemon guns distributed to Indians by the U.S. government at treaty conventions. Less common were surplus 58 caliber rifled muskets of American Civil War vintage, such as the pattern 1853 Enfield and Springfield model 1861. Metal cartridge weapons were prized by native combatants, such as the Henry and the Spencer lever-action rifles, as well as Sharp's breech loaders. Bows and arrows were utilized by younger braves in lieu of the more potent firearms, effective up to 30 yards, 27 meters. The arrows could readily maim or disable an opponent. Sitting Bull's forces had no assured means to supply themselves with firearms and ammunition. Nonetheless, they could usually procure these through post traders, licensed or unlicensed, and from gunrunners who operated in the Dakota Territory. A horse or a mule for a repeater. Buffalo hides for ammunition. Custer's highly regarded guide, Lonesome Charlie Reynolds, informed his superior in early 1876 that Sitting Bull's forces were amassing weapons, including numerous Winchester repeating rifles and abundant ammunition. Of the guns owned by Lakota and Cheyenne fighters at the Little Bighorn, approximately 200 were repeating rifles corresponding to about 1 of 10 of the encampment's 2,000 able-bodied fighters who participated in the battle. 7th Cavalry. The troops under Custer's command carried 2 regulation firearms authorized and issued by the U.S. Army in early 1876. The breech-loading, single-shot Springfield Model 1873 carbine and the 1873 Colt single-action revolver. The regulation Model 1860 saber or long knives were not carried by troopers upon Custer's order, except for a number of officers and scouts who opted for personally owned and more expensive rifles and handguns. The 7th Cavalry was uniformly armed. Ammunition allotments provided 100 carbine rounds per trooper, carried on a cartridge belt and in saddlebags on their mounts. An additional 50 carbine rounds per man were reserved on the pack train that accompanied the regiment to the battlefield. Each trooper had 24 rounds for his Colt handgun. The opposing forces, though not equally matched in the number and type of arms, were comparably outfitted, and neither side held an overwhelming advantage in weaponry. Lever-action repeaters vs. single-shot breech-loaders. 200 or more Lakota and Cheyenne combatants are known to have been armed with Henry, Winchester, or similar lever-action repeating rifles at the battle. Virtually every trooper in the 7th Cavalry fought with the single-shot, breech-loading Springfield carbine and the Colt revolver. Historians have asked whether the repeating rifles conferred a distinct advantage on Sitting Bull's villagers that contributed to their victory over Custer's carbine-armed soldiers. Historian Michael L. Lawson offers a scenario based on archaeological collections at the Henryville site, which yielded plentiful Henry rifle cartridge casings from approximately 20 individual guns. Lawson speculates that though less powerful than the Springfield carbines, the Henry repeaters provided a barrage of fire at a critical point, driving Lieutenant James Calhoun's L Company from Calhoun Hill and Finley Ridge, forcing it to flee in disarray back to Captain Miles Keogh's I Company and leading to the disintegration of that wing of Custer's battalion. Model 1873/1884 Springfield carbine and the U.S. Army. After exhaustive testing including comparisons to domestic and foreign single-shot and repeating rifles, the Army Ordnance Board, whose members included officers Marcus Reno and Alfred Terry, authorized the Springfield as the Springfield, manufactured in a 45-70 long rifle version for the infantry and a 45-55 light carbine version for the cavalry, was judged a solid firearm that met the long-term and geostrategic requirements of the United States fighting forces. Historian Mark Gallier claims that U.S. government experts rejected the lever-action repeater designs, deeming them ineffective in a clash with fully equipped European armies or in case of an outbreak of another civil conflict. Gallier's analysis dismisses the allegation that rapid depletion of ammunition in lever-action models influenced a decision in favor of the single-shot Springfield. The Indian Wars are portrayed by Gallier as a minor theater of conflict whose contingencies were unlikely to govern the selection of standard weaponry for an emerging industrialized nation. The Springfield carbine is praised for its superior range and stopping power by historian James Donovan, and author Charles M. Robinson reports that the rifle could be loaded and fired much more rapidly than its muzzle-loading predecessors, and had twice the range of repeating rifles such as the Winchester, Henry, and Spencer. Gallier points out that lever action at time when funding for the post where Army had been slashed, the prospect for economical production influenced the Ordnance Board member selection of the Springfield option. Malfunction of the Springfield carbine extractor mechanism. Whether the reported malfunction of the Model 1873 Springfield carbine issued to the 7th Cavalry contributed to their defeat has been debated for years. That the weapon experience jamming of the extractor is not contested, but its contribution to Custer's defeat is considered negligible. This conclusion is supported by evidence from archaeological studies performed at the battlefield, where the recovery of Springfield cartridge casing, bearing telltale scratch marks indicating manual extraction, were rare. The flaw in the ejector mechanism was known to the Army Ordnance Board at the time of the selection of the Model 1873 rifle and carbine, and was not considered a significant shortcoming in the overall worthiness of the shoulder arm. With the ejector failure in U.S. Army tests as low as 1/300, the Springfield carbine was vastly more reliable than the muzzle-loading Springfields used in the Civil War. Gallier addresses the post-battle testimony concerning the copper 45-55 cartridges supplied to the troops, in which an officer is said to have cleared the chambers of spent cartridges for a number of Springfield carbines. This testimony of widespread fusing of the casings offered to the Chief of Ordnance at the Reno Court of Inquiry in 1879 conflicts with the archaeological evidence collected at the battlefield. Field data showed that possible extractor failures occurred at a rate of approximately 130 firings at the Custer battlefield and at a rate of 137 at the Reno-Benteen battlefield. Historian Thom Hatch observes that the Model 1873 Springfield, despite the known ejector flaw, survivor claims, soldiers under Custer's direct command were annihilated on the first day of the battle except for 3 Crow scouts and several troopers, including John Martin Giovanni Martino, that had left that column before the battle. 1 Crow scout, Curley, was the only survivor to leave after the battle had begun, although for years rumors persisted of other survivors. Over 120 men and women would come forward over the course of the next 70 years claiming they were the lone survivor of Custer's last stand. The phenomenon became so widespread, Michael Nunnally, an amateur Custer historian, wrote a booklet describing 30 such accounts. W. A. Graham claimed that even Libby Custer received dozens of letters from men, in shocking detail, about their sole survivor experience. At least 125 alleged single survivor tales have been confirmed in the historical record as of July 2012. Frank Finkel from Dayton, Washington, had such a convincing story that historian Charles Kuhlman believed the alleged survivor, going so far as to write a lengthy defense of Finkel's participation in the battle. Douglas Ellison, mayor of Medora, North Dakota, and an amateur historian, also wrote a book in support of the veracity of Finkel's claim. Some of these survivors held a form of celebrity status in the United States, among them Raymond Hatfield, Arizona Bill Gardner, and Frank Tarbo. A few even published autobiographies that detailed their deeds at the Little Bighorn. A modern historian, Albert Winkler, has asserted that there is some evidence to support the case of Private Gustave Korn being a genuine survivor of the battle, while nearly all of the accounts of men who claimed to be survivors from Custer's column at the Battle of the Little Bighorn are fictitious. Gustave Korn's story is supported by contemporary records. Several contemporary accounts note that Korn's horse bolted in the early stages of the battle whilst he was serving with Custer's I Company, and that he ended up joining Reno's companies, making their stand on Reno Hill. Almost as soon as men came forward implying or directly pronouncing their unique role in the battle, there were others who were equally opposed to any such claims. Theodore Golden, a battle participant who later became a controversial historian on the event, wrote in regards to Charles Hayward's claim to have been with Custer and taken prisoner, "The Indians always insisted that they took no prisoners. If they did a thing, I firmly believe they were tortured and killed the night of the 25th. As an evidence of this I recall the 3 charred and burned heads we picked up in the village near the scene of the Big War dance, when we visited the village with Captain Benteen and Lute Wallace on the morning of the 27th. I'm sorely afraid, Tony, that we will have to class Hayward's story, like that of so many others, as pure, unadulterated BS. As a clerk at headquarters, I had occasion to look over the morning reports of at least the 6 troops at Lincoln almost daily, and never saw his name there, or among the list of scouts employed from time to time. I am hoping that someday all of these damned fakirs will die and it will be safe for actual participants in the battle to admit and insist that they were there, without being branded and looked upon as a lot of damned liars. Actually, there have been times when I have been tempted to deny that I ever heard of the 7th Cavalry, much less participated with it in that engagement. No, participated with it in that engagement, and engagement, and my Medal of Honor and its inscription have served me as proof positive, the only documented and verified survivor of Custer's command having been actually involved in Custer's part of the battle was Captain Keogh's horse, Comanche. The wounded horse was discovered on the battlefield by General Terry's troops, and although other cavalry mounts survived, they had been taken by the Indians. Comanche eventually was returned to the fort and became the regimental mascot. Several other badly wounded horses were found and killed at the scene. Writer Evan S. Connell noted in Son of the Morning Star, Comanche was reputed to be the only survivor of the Little Bighorn, but quite a few 7th Cavalry mounts survived, probably more than 100, and there was even a yellow bulldog. Comanche lived on another 15 years, and when he died, he was stuffed and to this day remains in a glass case at the University of Kansas. So, protected from moths and souvenir hunters by his humidity-controlled glass case, Comanche stands patiently, enduring generation after generation of undergraduate jokes. The other horses are gone, and the mysterious yellow bulldog is gone, which means that, in a sense, the legend is true. Comanche alone survived. Battlefield preservation. The site of the battle was first preserved as a United States national cemetery in 1879 to protect the graves of the 7th Cavalry troopers. In 1946, it was redesignated as the Custer Battlefield National Monument, reflecting its association with Custer. In 1967, Major Marcus Reno was reinterred in the cemetery with honors including an 11-gun salute. Beginning in the early 1970s, there was concern within the National Park Service over the name Custer Battlefield National Monument failing to adequately reflect the larger history of the battle between two cultures. Hearings on the name change were held in Billings on June 10, 1991, and during the following months Congress renamed the site the Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument. United States memorialization of the battlefield began in 1879 with a temporary monument to the U.S. dead. In 1881, the current marble obelisk was erected in their honor. In 1890, marble blocks were added to mark the places where the U.S. cavalry soldiers fell. Nearly 100 years later, ideas about the meaning of the battle have become more inclusive. The United States government acknowledged that Native American sacrifices also deserved recognition at the site. In 1991, bill changing the name of the national monument also authorized an Indian memorial to be built near Last Stand Hill in honor of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors. The commissioned work by Native artist Colleen Cutchell is shown in the photograph at right. On Memorial Day 1999, in consultation with tribal representatives, the U.S. added 2 red granite markers to the battlefield to note where Native American warriors fell. As of December 2006, a total of 10 warrior markers have been added, 3 at the Reno Benteen Defense Site and 7 on the Little Bighorn battlefield. The Indian Memorial, themed Peace Through Unity L, is an open circular structure that stands 75 yards, 69 meters from the 7th Cavalry obelisk. Its walls have the names of some Indians who died at the site, as well as native accounts of the battle. The open circle of the structure is symbolic, as for many tribes, the circle is sacred. The Spirit Gate window facing the cavalry monument is symbolic as well, welcoming the dead cavalrymen into the memorial. In popular culture, John Mulvaney's 1881 painting Custer's Last Rally was the first of the large images of this battle. It was 11 by 20 feet, 3.4 by 6.1 m, and toured the country for over 17 years. In 1896, Anheuser-Busch commissioned from Otto Becker a lithographed, modified version of Cassidy Adams' painting Custer's Last Fight, which was distributed as a print to saloons all over America. Edgar Samuel Paxson completed his painting Custer's Last Stand in 1899. In 1963, Harold McCracken, the noted historian and Western art authority, deemed Paxson's painting the best pictorial representation of the battle, and from a purely artistic standpoint, one of the best, if not the finest, pictures which have been created to immortalize that dramatic event. In 1927, Little Bighorn opened in theaters in the U.S., featuring Roy Stewart with John Beck as Custer. The 1964 novel Little Big Man by American author Thomas Berger and 1970 film of the same name includes an account of the battle and portrays a manic and somewhat psychotic Custer Richard Mulligan realizing to his horror that he and his command are being wiped out. In 2007, the BBC presented a one-hour drama documentary titled Custer's Last Stand. The May 2011 episode of the BBC Radio 4 program In Our Time featured Melvin Bragg and guests discussing the context, conditions, and consequences of the battle. In 2017, historian Daniel Boley covered the battle and the events leading to it in a three-part series on the History on Fire podcast.